Thank you very much. It is an honor for me to host the closing of this EurAfrican Forum 2023. It's our 6th edition, and I will call to join me on the stage the President of the Portuguese Republic, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, and the President of the Ghana Republic, Nana Akufo-Addo. Thank you very much for joining me.
Choose the place.
Yeah.
Yes, in the center. Yes.
Thank you very much. It is a real honor for me. As I said, this is our 6th EurAfrican Forum. And I would like to start asking the President of the Ghana Republic that when you look at these meetings, and it is our 6th meeting, it is the time for conversation, or actually it is the time, as Antonio said, for execution and delivering, because sometimes we see more talking and less execution and delivering.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this.
I would just ask you to speak a little bit.
A bit louder?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
I want to begin by thanking you very much for making me part of this dialogue. And, of course, President de Sousa, for the very gracious invitation to come and visit Portugal and pay a state visit to the country. I think talking is very important.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Dialogue and conversation and talking is very important because apart from everything else, it helps you clarify your ideas and thoughts, and that has always to be the prerequisite for action. Because if there's no clarity in the thought, clarity in the action becomes very difficult. So we shouldn't look down and sneer at talking. Talking is important. It's an important prelude to any meaningful action. I'm particularly excited by the forum that has been created here for reasons that I think are self-evident. If ever there is a natural synergy in this world, it is a synergy between Europe and Africa. We have geography. I believe the distance between our two continents is 15 kilometers in the Strait of Gibraltar.
Yeah.
We have history that goes back thousands of years in terms of commerce and intercourse between Africa and Europe. Some of the history has been very unpleasant, especially the period of European colonization of our continent.
We know that very well.
Yes, it's a very unpleasant period. We're recovering from that, and I think that we are moving towards establishing a much more equitable relationship between Europe and Africa. But that shared history, which has also meant that now increasingly there are also shared values in governance, in our attitudes towards the way the world should be structured, is making it possible for us to develop and enhance that synergy and build upon it so that we can have a dialogue between the two civilizations, the two continents, that would lead to an improvement in the lot of both sides. So far, the world has been built on the principle that in order for me to be rich, you have to be poor. And I think that that is the most important matter that we are confronted with in this 21st century, is to have a different paradigm that looks at the possibility that we can be both rich at the same time. We can both prosper at the same time. And indeed, your prosperity and my prosperity become interlinked. And we support each other's prosperity because we're both prosperous. I think that that perhaps is, for me, the most important socio-political, socio-cultural, historical decision that we have to make in this world. that there is absolutely no reason to continue the old paradigm where one part of the world is immersed in poverty and the other part of the world is prosperous. It is good in itself. We have seen already the difficulties that imposes for global stability and security. And what we noticed out of this pandemic was the absolute need there is for us to find a way of being able to pull our resources and our energies and our thoughts together. The other is that there are 1.3 billion people today in Africa. And the anticipation, according to the statisticians, is that by 2050, there'll be 2.5 billion people who call themselves Africans, which therefore means that 1 in 4 people on the globe at that time will be an African. That is a dramatic statistic because it tells us that we're moving towards a world where Africa is going to be absolutely central to the future of humanity. And it requires, therefore, an understanding that here we are in the center of the universe, Europe, the northern, Africa, the southern part. That synergy that I'm speaking about, if indeed it works, will make it possible for us to provide the leadership to the world in how we should live together on this planet. How we should deal with issues to do with climate change, how we should deal with issues to do with sustainability, how we can deal with how the resources of the world should be properly apportioned and developed. So the various programs and agreements that have been reached in this forum, it's absolutely critical that we find a way to make them live and that they become real. But beyond it all has to be this paradigm of recognizing that the intercourse and the cooperation between the two groups of people, the African and the European, is what is going to make it possible for these agreements to be properly implemented. If there's still the old thinking about it's important that I take advantage over you before we can move forward, these ideas, no matter how finely scripted they are, will never ever happen. So it's important that we do the talking and agree on what it is indeed that we're looking for the future. And I think the future, along the lines of which I have described, is going to lift the civilization of man to a planet that has never been anticipated before. That we're going to see a new global civilization that will reflect more than ever the possibilities of mankind to be able to provide for itself a standard of living, a way of living, a way of being together that so far we have not seen on this planet. And that would be our contribution to the growth of mankind and of civilization. So,
very good point of view. So I would like to ask the President of the Portuguese Republic, when you look at these demographic views from the United Nations, it's crystal clear that Africa will be huge in 2050. The third more populated country in the world would be Nigeria after India and China, and that's a huge change, you know. We're not used to that. India surpassed China this April, but Nigeria will be the third more populated country in 2050. But when we look at the conversations and discussions we're having in the European Union, we're talking about decoupling, where the United States is going, where China is going, where Europe is staying, or where should it move. But we don't see Africa at the center of our discussions in the European Union. Why? And why? Because of our history, of our vicinity, and all the demographic changes that we are seeing and looking at these huge continents.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ricardo Costa, for your moderation. Thank you, Diaspora Council. Thank you, Nova School, this university. Thank you, Chairman Barroso, he is no longer here. Thank you, President Sousa, for this so important EurAfrican edition. Thank you, especially President Nana Akufo-Addo. It's an honor for you and for us, but mostly for us, to be together discussing such an important subject. Well, frankly, I would say I do agree with you. We have history, we have geography, we have culture, we have so many connections. No other two continents are alike. No other. Not Europe, Asia, not Africa, Asia, not Americas, Europe, Asia, Pacific, no, nothing. Anyway, as you said, we have Europe very much Eurocentric, and you have in Africa a population that is growing, but with poverty and with conditions that apparently are not known and perceived and understood by so many Europeans. And being frank, of course, we can speak of the gateway, so many millions for Africa. It's increasing till 2030. We can say that most of it goes together with your objectives for 2063, African Union. But Africa is not the priority for Europe. Why not? One part of Europe does understand Africa. There are countries that never had the experience of knowing Africa well. Or they had it and forgot it. Well, some Eastern European countries didn't have that experience. Some Central European countries didn't have that experience. The Nordic had that experience in the 70s, 80s, and 90s last century. But in a way, they do not consider, some of them, some public opinions, a priority. The Southern European countries do know it better. But there also, I used to say, we are living the end of the empires. The empires ended apparently a long time ago. And the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, in the case of Portugal. But it remained a way of looking at Africa that is Eurocentric. Not accepting that the African view is the African view, is not the European view on Africa. So, this happened before the pandemic. The pandemic and climate change helped and sustainability to understand there is just one world. It's easy to say it that way, one world, but to convert it into priority, not the same. And the war turned Europe into more Eurocentric, forgetting the rest of the world. Being a global war, it is a global war involving all superpowers or emergent powers. They are there, directly and indirectly. And the whole world is suffering the effects of it. So, in a way, there is a problem of perception, European perception, perception of the European public opinions. We must not forget that populist movements, inorganic movements, nationalist and xenophobic movements are going up in so many countries in Europe. And one of the effects is that they do not understand and do not accept the difference, the cultural difference. So geopolitically, that's the problem. While there is private sector investing in Africa, while there are public policies from some states concerning Africa, the trend in the last few years was not always favorable to this priority. And the war made it a little bit even more complex. And that is very, very worrying. It is very worrying because it's not just with Africa, but it's worse concerning Africa. It's with Latin America and not necessarily with Asia. Meaning that if by chance tomorrow the balance of powers gives us United States, superpower, and China emerging as a second superpower, if European Union, and I mean European Union means European states, 27 states, and public opinions, do not play the role they should play in Africa, for instance.
But they are not playing.
And they are not playing. As the French used to say, the absence are always wrong. And we, Portugal, are many, many times one of the few exceptions.
But how do you look at, when you look at this, one of the main keywords of this year, this difficult year of 2023 is decoupling, you know, the idea of the United States decoupling from China and Europe decoupling from China. When you look at this realignment of the supply chains, there are lots of companies and so on moving to South America, to Mexico, others moving into Europe, but they are not moving to Africa, where it should be quite easy to set up some factories and so on, but they are not moving there.
Because there is no such priority. It's a pity. It could become a huge mistake. There is not that priority. We have it, Portugal, we have it. We have it geopolitically. It's needed to have a UN mission. Because speaking of Africa, you have institutional conditions, and the President Nana has spoken of it very, very often, to fight against coup d'etat, to try to create security, safety, stability. And we belong to some missions, and we see the Europeans disappearing from those missions. We have Africans in those missions, but even those like France or United Kingdom or other important European countries, they are not there. They are not there in Central Africa. They are not necessarily there in Sahel. They do understand it's fundamental to be there to create conditions for education, for social conditions of security and safety, for investment. But they are not there. So we have very short time from now to the end of the war and in the post-war to understand that we can lose this unique occasion. We shouldn't. Europe shouldn't. And it's funny that now some Eastern European countries are starting to understand how important it is to change their points of view, but it's too slow. It takes too long. I'm optimistic as President Nana Akufo-Addo. We are optimistic.
I don't know if President will still be optimistic after
But
what you said.
But no, I'm optimistic in the sense that I feel, I do understand this is happening. Some people don't understand it's happening. I don't accept the trend in the public opinions against it. And I think we need a stronger political will at the European level. But the European level means that the key European states must agree on it. They agree when it's about their investment, the investment of their companies in state A, B, C, D, F. But I'm not sure that's enough. We want more. This partnership must be much stronger, much, much stronger. That's why it's so important, this kind of dialogue. And your fight for it, because it has been a continuous fight as political leader. But what we're seeing in Europe, till now, and with the help of the situation during the war, where there is bilateralism, where there is mostly the idea of solving the European problem before solving other problems, well, the partnership between Europe and Africa can't wait. The moment we'll get there, it's too late. The United States is understanding it, and China is there.
Mr. President, more or less the same question. How do you look at this, hesitation, European hesitation?
I'm not so sure about the hesitation, because what we're feeling on the continent is that, in fact, there's a new scramble for Africa that is taking place amongst a plethora of European companies and states. That far from it being an area of indifference, because once again, the new metals, especially the green metals that have arisen, are plentiful on the continent. And there's a big scramble to take advantage of those metals again. So the same phenomenon as occurred at the end of the 19th century that led us to the Berlin Conference. That phenomenon is beginning to play itself out again in contemporary Africa. Okay. What matters for us, and that is the most important part of the conversation from our point of view, is that we will not allow the same result to occur from this scramble as occurred in the first phase, because it is now our insistence is that this scramble should result in a much more equitable apportionment of the wealth that emanates from these green metals. My country, Ghana, lithium is there in abundance, and there are several important companies that are making major efforts to penetrate our market to be able to exploit them. I have so far made the decision that we will have no concessions on the lithium until the government has come out with a clear policy as to how these resources are going to be exploited. We're not just going to go in the old haphazard way in where these resources are appropriated. The resources will be exploited and developed within the context of a nationally agreed...
Your government is creating that context, and then after you will decide what to do.
Then we will then decide what to do. Okay. And lithium is one. There's several others, cobalt, all kinds of the new green metals that are being reproduced on the continent, that are attracting, in a very magnetic way, the interests of companies outside Africa. The Chinese, as you know, today are very active on our continent because perhaps they saw this coming and have already made the decision that Africa is going to be a very important project for them. So the idea that somehow or other the world is indifferent to Africa, well, from where I sit, I don't see it. Okay. On the contrary, I'm seeing a lot of interest in the development of our country. But what has yet not been fully established, which has to be, is the relations that has to be worked out for this new, what I call scramble for Africa, to be able to work itself out successfully for the African peoples. So the issues that we have to deal with, the developments within Europe, which we cannot control, are matters obviously that will weigh with us, but what we have to deal with are the concrete results of how Europeans and European companies, European governments want to deal with. obviously there is a major issue that remains a very important point of contact between us and you, and that's the process of migration. Where still many, many young Africans, because they don't see chances for themselves on the continent, insist on attempting to migrate to Europe. And of course, that is part of what has now become part of the internal politics of Europe, how you react to this migration. I think that many of the populist governments that have movements that have arisen in Europe are in direct response to this pressure that migration is putting on European nations. And it is understandable. But clearly, the migration is in itself going to diminish when the opportunities are being created. And I think that that is where all the progressive forces on the continent are turning their attention to. How to make sure that we create these opportunities at home for our own people, so that the energies that the young people have are energies that are devoted to the development of our countries and of our continent. It's going to be difficult. Building success and prosperity has never been easy anywhere in the world, and it will not be easy in our part of the world either, especially when we have to deal with some preconditions that are absolutely critical. The issue of security and stability. West Africa, for instance, has as a major challenge the jihadist threat that has taken over the Sahel. The Sahel is the upper part of West Africa, the part between the Sahara and the coast. And in Mali and in Burkina Faso, to extent in Niger, to extent in the northern part of northern Nigeria, you've seen these jihadist movements attempting to penetrate, to take over. It's a fight that we have to win. We can't allow them to take over our states. And that is not because anybody is anti-Muslim, but we are anti-terrorists. We can't allow terrorist states to proliferate in our part of the world. They've been driven out of the Middle East, out of Afghanistan. They came to rest in Libya. And when Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, they had to leave, and many of them crossed the Sahara and took up refuge in Mali. And from there, they've been extending their influence, such as it is, eastwards in West Africa. That is a major challenge for us, because without security, without stability in our states, it's obviously going to be difficult for us to create the conditions for rapid economic growth. So that's a major challenge that we will have to overcome. And we're determined to overcome it. We are not prepared to have our nations taken over by these people.
You talked a lot about these natural resources, but do you think there are more areas where this cooperation can improve very quickly? You know, different kind of like factories, energy, green transition, and so on?
We're going to have to do it. We're going to have to do it. There's just absolutely no way, because if we continue the exploitation of these resources in the way we did in the past, it is going to mean the perpetuation of poverty on our continent. And that is not an acceptable situation. It is, that's the pathway to major instability on the continent itself, and that, of course, has a way of translating itself into instability outside the continent as well. So we're going to have to, by force of circumstances, chart a new path for the development of these resources.
Mr. President, the same question: what do you think are the most important areas where we should cooperate, mainly for companies, private companies?
Well,
for states also.
There are positive preconditions. I spoke mostly of the difficulties under the European point of view in this precise moment. But we look at Africa and African integration. is improving. Global objectives have been defined. An area of free trade has been a success, and we owe it mostly to Ghana. And I must make my compliment to Ghana and to President Nana, because Ghana is not only an example of democracy, stability, security, safety, but also of leadership concerning free trade, African integration, sustainable development, growth, recovery now, 4% already this year. And this is a very impressive example. And even the definition of the objectives goes along with what Europe can do, and for instance, Portugal can do together with Ghana. Interconnections, both physical and digital. There we can work together. Energy transition, there one can go together. Qualifications, knowledge, education, the same. Training, infrastructures, key infrastructures. We're working on it already. So there are objectives, common objectives, easy to define and to implement. No disagreement about it. More than that, the work of some important African states concerning looking at the inequalities between the different regions of Africa and understanding that this inequality is bad for the whole continent. The fact, we mentioned both, of institutional conditions, peace, security and safety. And so for private investment, this is very, very important. The fact that in Ghana, there is no one of those factors of instability, so important, as one of the leading countries concerning not only democratic indicators, but more than that, a whole ambiance favorable to private investment. And this that is happening in Ghana and in some other African countries should be the general rule more and more in the future, at least in some regions of Africa. Because we know private investment will go there with no doubts, with no hesitations, with no anguishes. The moment it's easy to make that partnership based on an objective reality.
But Mr. President, do you think that this private investment can go further or behind, infrastructure and natural resources?
Yes,
because lots of private companies in Portugal, in Europe, or in the United States look at Africa like, natural resources, infrastructures, natural resources, and they don't go behind this cycle.
But that's the old story.
Yeah.
Now we're changing. I mean, it's important infrastructure, water supply, of course, roads,
education, and so on.
interconnection, physical interconnection, they are very important, of course, and construction. But we're speaking of something else, energy, digital, knowledge, technological sector. That's completely different. And that's really the step we are working on. Ghana is working on it. Some other African countries are also joining the same efforts. And that's the way we see the Portuguese presence and the presence of the private sector, European private sector. We look at the figures, and we see that speaking of projects, the United States first, then one or two European countries. One of them, United Kingdom, the other one, France or Germany. And then we see China with less projects, but larger volume of jobs and of investment. But it's still the old investment, infrastructures, not this new one. And we should, as Europe, as a whole, as Europe, not just 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, develop this new cycle and in a way open this new cycle of investment in Africa. It's there, it's happening in some countries. Not all of them, it's happening, it's changing with young generations, with skills, with not only just the dimension of the labor market, of the population, but of the whole economy. So the problem is to make the bridge between the old investment and the new investment. It is happening. What I think it's being too late sometimes and too slow. That's a problem. Too slow. I don't think it's not happening. It is happening, but not in so many countries where we have failed countries, failed states, or we have just chaotic political situations. And we cannot admit that this kind of situation spreads as it has been happening in Central Africa, in some Eastern African countries, and even coming to the south of Africa. That should disturb unhappily, that could disturb unhappily the whole African integration. And nobody would wish it.
Well, Mr. Da Costa, I think there's something that perhaps all of us also ought to focus on. You look at the economic history of America, you look at the economic history of Europe. This emphasis on infrastructure was key to sparking the industrial and the economic development of America. I mean, the dramatic transformation of America that followed upon the construction of the railways across the continent. The same phenomena would occur within the African context if we were able to arrive at connecting our continent with infrastructure, with railways, with roads. Because that is how then you create opportunities for businesses to be able to develop. But in the present context, where it is extremely difficult to go from Accra to Bissau, it's very difficult to be able to organize businesses between the two places. So the emphasis that foreign investors would have in infrastructure as well as the naturals, for me, is not retrograde. It is helpful, so long as we can do it on the right terms. Because the absence of infrastructure is one of the most serious disadvantages that growing the economies of Africa are facing. We need to be able in this generation to deal with these issues of roads, of rail, of connection. Because without it, it's going to be very difficult to create the conditions for businesses to grow. So far from it being somehow irrelevant, it is central to the development of the African economy. Because I think even, I don't know how well you know the continent, but were we to wake up in 5 years' time to see that there are railways that connect Nairobi to Dakar, and highways that do the same, I think that the transformation...
It's a huge change,
be a huge change in the economies of the continent, of all the countries that span this level of development. So the infrastructure development of the continent is absolutely primordial. It is essential if we are going to be able to make a really serious attempt to grow our economies. We can't do it without it. And in fact, the calculations that have been made as to the hundreds of billions of dollars that are required to do it in themselves create an opportunity. But as all times, in this new arrangements that some of us are looking for, we need to be able to do it on the right terms.
And it's easy for you, for your country to do it, because of course you have a difficult debt cycle, economical situation, inflation. In Europe you have lots of inflation also. It is easy for you to surpass all these difficulties in this economical environment?
It's not easy. It's not easy. It's not easy to surpass the difficulties, but certainly it can be achieved. And in Ghana, we're making a serious effort to achieve it. You're not by yourself. You're not an island all onto your own, because you're operating within a context.
Yeah, I know.
And that context, of course, is not a favorable one. But nevertheless, I think with determination, especially the political will to get a result, we believe that we can get the results that we require for our future. But it is important also, of course, that we are in a position to reach out to people outside who have the same understanding of what it is that we're attempting to do and who can find a way of being able to cooperate with us. That is why I'm here, to try and create that sense of understanding with the political leadership and with the business community that is here. So that, for instance, I'm very excited about the whole idea of the Diaspora Council. That I had no idea that you had such an institution here, because that has become a very important aspect of our thinking in Ghana. I don't know whether you know it. 4 years ago, in 2019, we launched a program in Ghana called the Year of Return. Because 2019 was exactly 400 years since the first slaves were sent to the Commonwealth of Virginia in the United States. And we decided, I don't know whether the word is, no, I shouldn't use the word celebrated, but to commemorate that event by organizing the Year of Return, which was then to invite all the global African diaspora to come to Ghana so that we could hold hands, to say to ourselves, never again would we allow ourselves to be put in this condition where Africans can just be taken out of their homes and sent outside into bondage, etc. That we would work together now to see how we can protect our own interests in the world. And it turned out to be a major success. Over 1 million diasporans came back to Ghana. And since then, Ghana has become a sort of a magnet for the global African diaspora. Christmas time, in the course of the year, there are hundreds of thousands of diasporans coming to the country and enjoying its culture, its music, its dance, and the rest of it. So it has become now a very important feature of our thinking about how we would develop the country and develop our economy. And there is, for the first time, in the office of the President of Diasporan Office, we have the whole structure of what we need to do to encourage the diasporan engagement. Laws have now been revised to be able to do that. And we're attracting a lot of interest from the African diaspora in Ghana, not just the cultural aspect of it, but also the economic aspect of it, especially since we're also creating the educating of our youth. Now the mandev, the skill base to be able to take advantage of people's interest in the country, the educational reforms that are taking place in Ghana are very far-reaching. The man responsible for them is here with us, the Minister for Education of Ghana, who's been spearheading the revolution in our educational reforms in Ghana, so that we can have the quality of young people that we need to build a new economy. So I was really fascinated to see about this, and that you're the president of the Diaspora Council. Congratulations, and we wish you the very best of luck. Thank you very much.
Okay. I thank you both, Mr. President of the Ghana Republic and President of the Portuguese Republic. I think it was an excellent closing for this 2 days meeting. It was our 6th edition of EurAfrica Forum. So thank you very much. I hope you can see you next year here with very good news, with no war, less inflation, and a very good prospect for our lives and for the next decades, both in Europe and Africa. Thank you very much.